Okay, everyone, welcome to the week of March 14th. And what I want to do today is kind of, since we haven't done one of these in a while, just give you a little heads up of where we are right now, what you should know, and also where we're going, because we don't really have a whole lot of stuff left this year. We're already in the first quarter of the 20th century, and we end really at the Cold War. Decolonization is the end. Technically, the course goes all the way to the present, but there are no recent events on the AP test, trust me. So what we've seen so far and what you should know is World War I, of course. I did a presentation on the causes of World War I, and they can be summarized pretty easily. It's imperialism and nationalism and everything else. You do not need to know for the AP test a battle-by-battle summary or details of the war. All you need to know is that the new weapons of war, the industrialized weapons of war, led to massive casualties. And if you can name one of those, if you have to pull that up for an essay, that would be great. From the video, you have all kinds of examples. And for massive casualties, the Battle of the Somme is mentioned in that video called Shell Shocked, which is still in its learning. The causes of the war, then we have the consequences of the war, and I have some podcasts on that and a video on that, and that's the most important thing that we've studied at this point. Excuse me, the consequences of the First World War. You have the Peace Treaty of Versailles, where the nations come together to try to decide what the world's going to look like, is really a disaster. President Wilson shows up wanting to end empires, wanted to create this League of Nations, kind of like the present UN, where nations come together and talk things out. He wants colonized people to have independence. And of course, he's the hero of the colonized world. But what he finds when he gets to Versailles, which is that city right outside of Paris, where they negotiate the world or put the world back together after the war, what he finds when he gets to this big post-war meeting is that the victorious nations, the French and the British particularly, they don't want to cooperate. They want to punish Germany, and they want Germany's empires. They want its colonies, and they want the Ottoman Empire that has been dismembered. They want to split it up and to colonize it. So the opposite of what Wilson wanted. The only part of Wilson's plan that worked, that was approved, was something called the League of Nations, which I mentioned, and the U.S. didn't even join it. The Russians weren't invited to join it, as they had become the Soviet Union. So the League of Nations really didn't have that much authority. The second try for such an organization was after World War II, when they created the UN, the United Nations, which is still around today. But the League of Nations didn't turn out to be much. Unfortunately, Wilson would die of a stroke in 1919. And the idea, what the Allies wanted to do is punish Germany. I think one of my videos talked about it. I just taught this in class today. It's still on the board behind me. They forced Germany to pay back all the damage they'd done. Germans had to admit full guilt for the war. They lost their colonies. The map of Europe was withdrawn, and Czechoslovakia, a new country that was created, took a big bite out of Germans' own land in Germany. Since Germany and Russia bordered each other and they had fought terribly in the war, the borders were pushed aside and Poland was created and went right between them. And by the way, World War II would start with Russia and Germany attacking Poland simultaneously to reestablish their pre-World War I borders, to destroy Poland. That's how the Second World War started. So you have these things. The Germans weren't able to keep an army and so forth. These absolutely humiliated Germany and economically crushed Germany and created the foundations for the rise of radical parties, including the National Socialist Party, which later becomes known as the Nazi Party. And that is, of course, the party of Adolf Hitler. Excuse me. Hitler rises to popularity by breaking every single one of these things. He stops paying back for the war. He stops paying other nations. He builds this massive military. He takes land back from Czechoslovakia before the war even starts. And he's the hero of Germans. Remember, their nationalism, their pride had been devastated by World War I. And by the way, the end of World War I, where the Germans actually surrendered and signed the papers, was in the train car where the French sat on one side of a table, the Germans sat on the other side of the table in this train, and the Germans signed this complete surrender to the Allies. The French put that as a memorial in a museum-like place. Jumping ahead 20 years, when Hitler invaded France in World War II, Paris fell this time, and he took France. Hitler took that train out of the museum and put it back on the tracks where it was 20 years before, and he forced the French to surrender in the very same place. This time they're sitting on opposite sides of the table. World War II was revenge for all these humiliations that happened to Germany in the First World War. The other very important thing is what happened to the Ottoman Empire. And I'm not going to get into big details about this because there's a podcast about this, how the British promised to Jews that they'll be able to return to their ancestral homeland after the war, but also Britain promised the Arabs who live there, which is Palestine, that they would get a nation if they rebelled against the Ottomans from within. And of course, those are mutually incompatible promises, and it has led to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict today. So there's much more detail there about that. The British mandate system will carve up the Ottoman Empire, take these groups of people and make the French mandate, which is just a fancy name for a colony, and the British mandate. And what absolutely humiliates the Arabs is that the Turks, which they were this center, they were the Ottoman Empire. They sided with Germany, remember, the enemy of Britain and France. The Turks got their own nation. They got the nation of Turkey, where the Arabs who revolted, helping the British, they feel like they were stabbed in the back. And those grievances may seem like ancient history here in the United States, but they are absolutely alive and well in the Middle East today. That broken promises made by imperialists continue today, they would argue, and have led to the problems in the Middle East. So the podcast covers a lot of that. Now, what you have after World War I during the 1920s, two main trends happen that you need to know about in AP World History. And one is a massive economic contraction that we actually call the Great Depression. So stock markets, the banks fails in Vienna, Austria, the stock market crashes in New York City, and unemployment goes up to 25%. The global capitalist economy collapses in October 1929. And it's an incredible thing historically, because the nations that weren't capitalists, that were dictatorships, Soviet Russia, didn't feel this at all. And it seemed to validate to the Russians that they had this system, this economic system, communism, that insulates itself from the markets and everything else that causes such volatile economic movements in the capitalist world. But with the crashing of global markets, it really discredited democracy in some people's eyes. It's the Great Depression that moves people to be much more accepting of authoritarian governments, of dictatorships. So you have to keep the 30s in mind. The United States has a very strong, we don't have a dictator, we have a very strong president who just does lots of things to help the economy that people just simply vest their power in and are interested in seeing that happen. The government gets much more involved in the economy than it ever has before. The president is FDR, or Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and you should know that one thing the U.S. does to get involved in the economy is something called the New Deal, where there's Social Security, there's welfare payments, the government builds bridges and dams, and these are all major government projects to give work to people. So the point is this: during the Great Depression, governments all over the world got much more powerful. They dug much deeper into the lives of ordinary people. Extreme examples of that are what you have in Europe with the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy. So fascism is a single-party system. It allows no dissension. Fascism controls state media. So this was not possible before the 20th century, the absolute control of state media. It's extremely nationalistic and looks back to its past and resurrects these ideas of ancient greatness. Mussolini, the fascist leader of Italy, brings back all these images of the great Roman Empire, okay? And Hitler invents this Germanic past of Nordic mythologies and the Aryan race to try to bring up this intense German system of nationalism. And fascist governments also have state police that are absolutely brutal and crush dissent, and they use terror, or they intentionally provoke fear in their people to focus loyalty on the government. So that's an extreme version of governments becoming more involved. Hitler buys a radio for every family in Germany, and that's not so they can listen to Taylor Swift. That's so he can communicate directly to these people. That's so he can propagandize right into people's homes. So you have that. That's one trend you see in the 1930s. You see governments getting more involved and people becoming less certain that democracy actually works. And I think one of my podcasts talks about this. The ideas of Freud become very popular. Freud believes that we're not really rational people. We're driven by deep, dark instincts that we suppress because they're kind of bad. And if that's true, how can people be trusted to make the decisions? And that's what democracy is. So you have to believe that human beings are rational if you believe a democracy can work. If we're irrational, we need to be led. And so these ideas had great currency during the 1920s, and especially in the 1930s. The other major trend between World War I and World War II, besides Great Depression and government involvement, is independence movements became much more focused. And you really only need to know one great example of this, and the example I'm going to use is South Asia or India. Indians fought in World War I, on the side of the British, not because they hated Germans, but because they were enlisted by the British with the promise of independence. When the war was over, of course they didn't get independence. Over 1 million people from South Asia were mobilized in some way for the British war effort, hoping to get independence. When the war was over, Britain did not give them independence. And as a matter of fact, the mood for independence was very high in what is today India. And the British smacked them with what's called the Rowlatt Act, which took away their freedoms of speech, it took away their freedoms of assembly. It was meant to repress their ability to communicate and form a large front for independence. So this just stoked the fires of Indian nationalism, of course. So India was pining for independence, but the problem was, since the Mughal Empire ended, and that was when the British took over in 1858, the Mughals were Muslims, but they were a minority. And independent India would be ruled by Hindus. So the Muslim minority started to feel, man, independence might be a terrible thing because we're going to be repressed by Hindus who will be the majority in the country. So they formed something called the Muslim League. The Muslim League was there to advocate for the rights of the Muslim population of South Asia. On the other side of that, you had the Indian National Congress. Now, the Indian National Congress had its roots back when Britain colonized India. It was an organization that was kind of a liaison or communication organization between colonized Indians and the British. But after World War I, the Indian National Congress, or the INC, became the organization for Indian independence. What they needed was a face. They needed a person to front this, and the perfect person they found in Gandhi. Because Gandhi, first of all, was British educated, so he was fluent in English. That means he could communicate with all of the middle class, British educated Indian people. But there was also something about him when he discarded all the Western dress and donned the simple robe of a Hindu holy man that made him very appealing to the lower classes and the Hindus and the mystics as well. So he was that perfect focal point for various levels of Indian society, and Gandhi became the face of the INC. So it had everything it needed to do to pine for independence. The British are going to be repressive. Gandhi's strategy will shape this independence movement. His strategy is nonviolence, it's peaceful resistance, it's breaking British rules that he feels are immoral, like the salt tax, where the Indian people can't harvest their own salt from the shore like they did for thousands of years. They have to give it to the British, who then sell it back to them. Gandhi led the famous Salt March to protest that and was arrested and thrown in jail. You have several other acts. Gandhi at the spinning wheel, making his own clothes, which was illegal because the British said you can only buy clothes from us and our factories. That was meant to, of course, benefit the British economically. So although independence was not successful for South Asia between World War I and World War II, it got extremely focused. It found its front man, and it became extremely organized. World War II is going to weaken Britain to such an extent that independence will be a no-brainer after the Second World War. But that's the story of a more focused independence movement. You have similar things going on in Indochina, which is Vietnam. It actually declared its independence, but France was not going to let it go, and France would hold on to Indochina and also Algeria in Africa. So two main currents you have here between the wars. You have the Great Depression and the rise of more authoritarian states, and then you have the push for independence. So the next major topic is World War II, and there's a video about World War II, and then that will bring us to the end of the week. The next topics in the next coming weeks are going to be the Cold War, decolonization, and globalization, and we will finish on time this year. And for me, on time means mid-April, and that gives us a month to review for the test, to look at possible essay topics you might encounter, and to also go over again how you write the essays. What we're going to continue next week is look at the document-based question, which is pretty important. So if you haven't written the LEQ, please do so. We'll see how well you do on that. If we need to go back and review some of that stuff, we will. But that's where we are right now. So thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next week.